Okay, so WMO put out a report just now in 2022, which is called United in Science 2022. It's a multi-organization, high-level compilation of the most recent science related to climate change, climate impacts, and climate responses. Obviously, repeats some of the things we have already talked about or re-emphasizes them, let's say. But I wanted to include it because it has a unique approach where it also looks at the climate change and carbon cycle emissions, etc., in the last 5 years and makes predictions for just the next 5 years, which is very unique and very important, I think, because as you know from my earlier podcast, that I'm a bit skeptical about projections beyond 2050 where scenario uncertainties, the representative concentration pathways, the shared socioeconomic pathways that are used, they tend to dominate the projections, whereas in the earlier period there's a very strong wind, but hopefully it's not bad. The earlier timescales tend to be dominated by model uncertainties, which we know much more about. Also, with the COVID, we know that expecting how the global humanity, social, economic systems, etc., will respond in the future, especially when a crisis comes along. So this is kind of the summary wheel diagram looking at United in Science. You can start here. 2015 to 2021 were the 7 warmest years on record happened. We have seen this in many different ways. Each decade has been warmer than the previous, and all the records are being now broken more recently. Atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations continue to increase despite the 25 years of negotiations. This is bad news. Also raises a question about relying on technological promises to chart out future pathways. So we'll look at some details on this. Climate change made extreme heat and floods worse in 2022, but early warning systems can reduce risks. So Europe has been hammered. US, India, China, every country, every continent you can think of has been hammered by extreme events, floods and droughts in 2022. The Russian war on Ukraine has only amplified some of the weaknesses in the way we rely on energy. For example, Germany was always proud of getting a lot of its energy from renewables, but the Russian war has exposed its reliance on gas from Russia. Cities are major contributors to global emissions and highly vulnerable to climate impacts. So we'll look at a little section on urban climate change issues. As global warming increases, tipping points in the climate system cannot be ruled out. This is a very humble and a cautious statement. Just the previous podcast, I looked at the tipping points paper from Science that just appeared this week in September 2022 as well, where the authors provide temperature thresholds for triggering tipping points and raise an alarm that 1.5 degrees C warming target may already trigger some tipping points. As I said in that podcast, I'm not sure of the value of adding such uncertain message to an already urgent message that's out there. There is a 93% chance that at least 1 year between 2022 to 2026 will be the hottest on record. This is clear as we keep getting hottest years on record happening. One has to watch out because sometimes there are surprises. So even though 2015 was the strongest El Nino of the 21st century, it didn't necessarily produce the warmest year on record. So there is always surprises on how the energy gets distributed in the system. The energy that is trapped by greenhouse gas increases. Strong wind, sorry. Ambition of new emissions reductions pledges need to be 7 times higher to meet the 1.5 degree C goal. So this is a better message than the tipping point message, basically because this emphasizes the need for urgent action on mitigation and adaptation without throwing more uncertainties into the mix. Finally, CO2 emissions in early 2022 were higher than pre-pandemic levels in early 2019. So we had a dip during the pandemic, and then we have zoomed right back to the previous levels and maybe even higher. Basically also because many of the economies that suffered during the COVID lockdowns provided stimulus funds to revive the economy, but those stimulus funds did not necessarily go into climate action, climate friendly expenditures, or just simply encouraged people to go out and spend more to jumpstart the economies and so on and so forth. Okay, so the key messages, just to start out: atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations continue to rise, and fossil fuel emissions are now above pre-pandemic levels after a temporary drop due to lockdowns associated with the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 and 2021. Recent years saw record high temperatures and ocean heat. Looking forward, there is a 48% chance that at least 1 year in the next 5 years, annual mean temperature will temporarily be 1.5 degrees C above that in 1850 to 1900. In other words, we will cross the 1.5 degrees C threshold, which is used as one of the safer targets. And as I've said before, the question is, headlines will be blaring saying we crossed 1.5 and we may come back down, and nothing may happen in terms of tipping points or additional extremes and so on. So people are bound to wonder what this 1.5 degree C target actually means. So we have to be very careful about that. But you can see that the probability is 48%, so that's less than 50%. So it's a very cautious note as well. Mitigation pledges are insufficient to achieve the Paris Agreement. Enhanced action is needed to prevent the continued warming that's increasing the likelihood of irreversible changes in the climate system known as tipping points. Okay, so we discussed this in the previous podcast, and I won't say more about this, but enhanced action is needed to prevent the continued warming that is increasing the likelihood is a very cautious note on which to warn people. Billions of people around the world are exposed to climate change impacts. Cities responsible for up to 70% of the human-caused emissions, will face increasing socio-economic impacts, and the world's most vulnerable populations will suffer most, as seen in recent extreme weather events. So the climate justice, climate equity, loss and damage, for example, the massive flood in Pakistan, for example, let's say was made worse, much worse, by climate change. And the climate change is, let's say, mostly because of the emissions from the rich countries. Then are there ways to compensate Pakistan for getting hit with this big flood? So these are very challenging debates, and there are no agreements as such yet. Adaptation is crucial to lower the risk to climate impacts, obviously. This is the idea of managing the unavoidable and avoiding the unmanageable kind of philosophy. Early warning systems can save lives, reduce losses and damages, and contribute to disaster risk reduction and support climate change adaptation. So early warning systems as an effective tool for climate adaptation haven't gotten enough attention. There is a global project called the S2S prediction and application. S2S is sub-seasonal to seasonal time scale, so 1 to 3 days, 3 to 10 days, weeks 2 to 4, and out to a season to multiple seasons, like El Nino and monsoons, active and break periods, heat waves, floods, air quality issues, wildfires, etc., all being attempted to be predicted at a scale where decisions can be made. And these are managing the situation right now in terms of the climate impacts that are already here. I find this myself personally to be much more of a valuable effort than focusing on what will happen in 2100 based on all those scenarios which just add uncertainties to the projections. Okay, so I'll stop this podcast here, and then we'll come back and look at greenhouse gas concentrations. I'll have to split this into multiple podcasts because it's a rather long report with good messages, so I don't want to rush and dilute the message. So let's do it in pieces, but let's start with the ones we already discussed in terms of an overview of what the state of climate has been in the last few years, what COVID has done, and where we are in terms of greenhouse gas emissions gaps to the global warming targets, and urban issues and climate action and so on. Okay, let me leave this here.